It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the BenQ EX2780Q. As usual for a video review, be aware that what you see depends on my camera, it depends on the editing done by my video editing software, depends on YouTube, and it ultimately depends on the monitor that you're actually viewing the video on or the screen that you're viewing the video on. So in no way are you getting an accurate representation of exactly what the monitor looks like firsthand. As usual, there's a written review which accompanies the video review, or as I prefer to say, the video review accompanies a written review, and there's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. This monitor uses a 27-inch IPS type panel, an Innolux AAS, that's azimuthal anchoring switch, which is a bit of a mouthful, and confusingly enough that also has VA vertical alignment variants of it, but this is an IPS type iteration of the technology. And this has a 144Hz refresh rate and a 2560 by 1440, that's WQHD resolution. The resolution allows you a decent amount of desktop real estate. You can see that the desktop icons there are a reasonable size, fairly small, so you can get quite a lot on the screen at the same time. Things have a decent clarity, and the screen surface, I like to mention that early on as well, light matte anti-glare, so it doesn't detract too much from the clarity and vibrancy potential. There's just what I call a light misty graininess, but this isn't something which most users will actually notice at all, because the representation of lighter colours, as I explore a little bit later, it's pretty smooth actually. Not as smooth as some, so LG's nano IPS type panels, competing models with AU Optronics AHVA panels, 27-inch IPS types as well. They're a bit smoother than this, but the difference isn't massive. And if you compare this to competing VA models or most competing TN models, the screen surface of this one's much smoother. So most people are going to find that just fine. Good amount of desktop real estate, as I said, so it's good for multitasking. You can have a document open with plenty of nice, pretty crisp looking text, a web page as well, side by side. So it gives you good potential there. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. It has a bit of an unusual look, a bit of a rustic aesthetic because of BenQ's choice of colours. So it has a reddish brown hue used for the bottom bezel and a bronze tone used for the stand base, and the stand base has a powder coated metal finish, so it has quite a nice solid feel to it. The bottom bezel is quite thick because it has the speakers there. It's also got this central sensor unit, so it has the Brightness Intelligence Plus sensor that controls various functionality of the monitor, including the HDRI, so it's got a little HDRI badge there as well, which is a shiny copper coloured badge. It's not a button, it's just a badge. I know on some models they have buttons there, some older BenQ monitors used to, but that's just a badge. Also the BenQ logo there. Speakers under here, this is actually a speaker grill. Has a hexagonal mesh, but it is a plastic finish, not metal. So there's a speaker there and another speaker there. There's also a volume rocker here, and that is explored in the OSD video. An alternative way to control the monitor, I mean there are also the main controls on the back of the monitor, which I'll show you shortly. There's also this little controller here, and again this is explored in the OSD video, but just to show you it quickly, there's a little silicone mat that's included, and the idea here is that you place that in the middle of the stand base. It doesn't have to be on the right side, it can be in the middle or over to the other side, whichever you prefer. And then you can just rest the controller on that, and it's a nice little place for it to sit when you're not using it. The top and side bezels have a dual stage design, so there's a slender panel border that blends in seamlessly with the rest of the screen, as well as a hard plastic outer component. So if you look at it from the right angle, you can just about see the panel border, but when the screen's off as it is now, it blends in pretty nicely. You will see it around the image when the monitor's switched on. But including both components, it's pretty slender, and you can see exact measurements in the written review. You also notice there's a little notch in the corner there. It looks like there's a tiny bit of the bezel missing, or a bit of the panel border missing. So same on the other side. That's completely normal. They're calibration marks used by the machine that puts the panel and everything else together, that's all. In terms of ergonomic flexibility, the monitor is very restrictive. It has a tilt-only stand. You can't adjust the height or swivel it or anything like that. You can just tilt it backwards a little bit, or you can tilt it forwards a little bit. monitor uses a light matte anti-glare screen surface, and that means that it offers decent glare handling. This is quite a bright room, so you can see some glare, but during normal use this wasn't a problem for me. It also means that the image isn't impeded as much as it is by stronger matte screen surfaces. So there's just what I call a light misty graininess rather than a smeary graininess or anything coarse and heavy. And this is something which most users are going to find absolutely fine. They're really going to think that the image looks quite smooth when you're observing lighter shades. From the side, you can see the backwards tilt angle. I've got it at the maximum backwards tilt angle just to show you that at the moment. From the side, it's pretty slender. There's not really much to the monitor there. You've got the basic stand design there. And if you look around the back, which I'll show you shortly, you can see that the stand attaches at the bottom. It doesn't have a central attachment point, and it's just a very simple stand design, which allows you to tilt it at that hinge there, but nothing else. Around the back of the monitor now, you can see it's mainly matte black plastic. There's a subwoofer at the top. That's this thing here. And it says there, Superior Sound by Trevolo, or however you pronounce that. I'm not really familiar with that company name, but something that BenQ is obviously quite proud of. And the speaker system on this is decent, and a large part of that is because of the subwoofer. It does have a decent bassiness to it, noticeably more than most monitor speakers. The OSD controls are there, and they're mentioned in the OSD video, so I'm not going to go through them again. The central region here, it just looks like it's got a little plate here. That's because it does, and you can remove that, which will give you access to 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. There's a K slot towards the bottom right there, and the ports are down firing. They include a 3.5mm headphone jack, two HDMI 2 ports, DisplayPort 1.2a, and HDMI and DisplayPort on this monitor. They support adaptive sync, and that includes AMD FreeSync on both HDMI and DisplayPort, and it includes NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort only. There's also a USB-C port. I don't have USB-C on my system, but I looked in the manual and did a little bit of digging, and I don't think that adaptive sync is supported by USB-C on this monitor, although it does have what they call DP Alt mode, so DisplayPort alternative mode, and it gives you 10 watts of power delivery as well, and it would allow data transfer like normal USB. On the other side, there is an AC power input, and that means that the monitor has an internal power converter rather than an external power brick. And just to finish off with the features and aesthetics, there's also a cable tidy system, and this little box here at the back can slot off. So if you push that up, it just pops off like that. And you can see that there's a mechanism there that you can use to feed a cable through and have it a bit neater than sort of something flailing around all over the place. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. I'm using a little bit of a different scene to what I usually use when I talk about this game, and that's just for a little bit of variety, because I know some people like to watch a lot of my videos and get a bit sick of seeing exactly the same thing all the time, even if it is with a different monitor. So this one has an IPS type panel. The contrast ratio, it's specified as 1000 to 1, but I recorded a little bit above that, around 1100 to 1 with my test settings. So in terms of the static contrast, isn't up to the level of VA panels, and certainly not some of the stronger VA performers, but by no means bad, and certainly some IPS type panels, for example those using LG's Nano IPS panels, they tend to have somewhat lower static contrast than this, so there's a bit of a difference there, a bit of an edge over some of these IPS type panels. But of course static contrast numbers, they only tell you part of the story. So IPS glow, it'll be a term many of you are familiar with. This is certainly a feature on this monitor. I'd say it has a fairly average level of IPS glow. However, there's always a caveat to IPS glow, and that is that it can be brought out more strongly if your unit has some issues with backlight uniformity, so backlight bleed and that kind of thing. And my unit does. Certainly in the bottom left corner there, it looks like IPS glow, there's a sort of haze there, but it's actually brought out more than it should be because of elements of backlight bleed there as well. To add insult to injury, the IPS glow towards the left side of the monitor has a cool tint to it, sort of cool white tint, slightly blue hue to it, whereas towards the right side it tends to be more subdued anyway because it has a more subtle, warmer tint. You might be able to see that on the video a bit. I know there's fire there, but ignore that. There's a little bit of slightly warm coloured IPS glow there, which is visible, versus the more noticeable cooler tint there. But when you've got the backlight bleed there as well, it does draw it out more. This isn't something that's going to affect all units, the backlight bleed that is. I mean, IPS glow, yes, it is going to affect all units. You can't escape from that with this model. But the backlight bleed here, it's not exactly a feature of this monitor or others using this panel. What I would say though is that I've gathered quite a lot of user feedback from monitors which use this panel or indeed a similar panel, just looking at high refresh rate IPS type models more broadly, and it isn't uncommon to have a fair bit of backlight bleed in places, a moderate amount, sort of a bit of patchiness. You can see a photo in the written review showing the backlight bleed in a more representative way, sort of how it appears to my eye when I'm looking at it. Of course, the actual representation you see in the photo, it does depend on your own monitor as well and the settings used there, but I would take a look at that as it gives a better representation than the video really of how the backlight bleed appears, and that's just backlight bleed isolated on its own without IPS glow and such like. Moving on though, so you don't get the perfect experience. I wouldn't really expect a perfect experience in terms of contrast from an IPS type model. That's really not their main strength at all. But even so, there are some advantages to this kind of panel when it comes to contrast and related features. One is the gamma consistency. So on VA models, you've got this black crush, as it's called, where shades appear darker in the center, so near black shades, slightly lighter than black, appear darker than they should, and they sort of blend into a black mass. You don't get that on this model. On TN models, you have gamma inconsistencies vertically, which mean that things appear sort of flooded and washed out towards the bottom of the screen, where the perceived gamma is much lower, and the perceived gamma higher up is much higher, and that means that things appear more blended than they should, deeper, darker, and a bit dodgy for that reason. So on this game, for example, there are subtle rock textures which show you when a wall is climbable. This isn't one of them. This is just a sort of normal rock texture really. But even so, these kind of details, the cracks in the rock here, they appear pretty consistent. There is the IPS glow, as I mentioned, so that does affect it peripherally, but you don't get this kind of gradient as you do on TN models vertically, and you don't have this central region that's more blended than it should be. That also means when you're watching film content or movie content on Netflix and that kind of thing, these have compression artifacts, as they're called, and these can be brought out more obviously than they should be if the monitor's gamma is a bit off, or the monitor has perceived gamma issues because of the panel type it's using. So with this more consistent gamma, the compression artifacts are quite nicely blended and they don't stand out more than they should. So that's a good thing as well. The screen surface, as I mentioned earlier, light matte anti-glare. So it gives a pretty smooth look to lighter content, and it certainly doesn't have the sort of obvious grainy or smeary grainy look that you get from some monitors with matte screen surfaces. And just note that you might have briefly seen some sort of stripes or weird patterns in the sky there. That's not from the monitor, that's just moire from the camera. It depends on the distance of the camera from the monitor, the pixel density of the monitor, and just the scene that's being displayed, the brightness levels, that kind of thing. So if you see these kind of weird patterns, it's not from the monitor, it's just moire from the camera. But yeah, the screen surface, it's something I'm sensitive to, and I don't find this screen surface bothersome. It's not quite as light and as smooth as some of the screen surfaces. The ViewSonic XG270QG with the LG Nano IPS panel, for example, that's a bit smoother. And the older models using the AU Optronics AHVA panels, the high refresh rate AHVA panels, they are a little bit smoother as well. But I would not describe this as grainy. It has sort of a light misty graininess, which most people aren't going to find bothersome or even necessarily notice at all. And I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor. And as usual, to start off, I like to use the Lagom tests for viewing angles. So with the Lagom text here, it ideally appears a blended grey throughout. On this monitor, it does appear very blended, although it does appear slightly more red towards the edges. Sorry for my hand there. It has a slight more of a red hue towards the striping peripherally, whereas centrally it's better blended and has a slight green hue to it. But compared to the kind of performance you get on VA models or TN models, there aren't the kind of obvious flashes between green and red and orange and strong saturation, so things appear far more blended than that. So that indicates a good low level of viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. So perhaps easier to relate to solid shades. So you've got this bluish purple block here. That appears largely a bluish purple, although it actually has more of a pink hue than it should, and that's actually a bit stronger towards the edges of the screen. Although the pink hue is actually more to do with the color gamut of this monitor, and it's got a bit less to do with the viewing angles. But the fact that the pink hue is a little bit stronger towards the very edges, that's a slight viewing angle weakness, but I'm saying slight because with VA and TN models you get this obvious bloom of pink which shifts very readily as you move your head. Now this does shift a bit when I move my head, but it's still very firmly within IPS type territory. This red block, very consistent. There's absolutely no mistaking this is an IPS type panel with this colour. Very consistent, rich red throughout. It's actually, to be fair, more consistent than average for IPS type models. So it just really depends on which shade you're viewing as to how good the viewing angle performance might be if you're being really picky. This green block as well, really nice and consistent. A good strong saturated green chartreuse throughout. That's the shade name, and it is displayed nicely. It doesn't have as much yellowing as you'd see on a monitor with a narrower color gamut. Also, it doesn't show the kind of strong yellowing in some regions of the screen versus others, which you'd get on non-IPS type panels. It's a little bit yellow at the very bottom, if I'm being picky again, but I do think this is being a bit picky because, as I'll show you with games and talk about with games as an example, these sort of very slight weaknesses in color consistency from normal viewing angles, you're not going to notice them in practice. The blue block, really good, consistent, rich blue throughout, although that's actually the case on TN models even. So this is an interesting shade because it's something which most monitors will show nicely, unless they have some strong uniformity issues for this particular shade, because that can also affect how things look. So overall, absolutely an IPS type panel. Slight weaknesses here compared to some. For example, LG's recent nano IPS type panels a little bit stronger, but I do stress this is a slight difference. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor. Now this is the key strength of IPS type models like this. So this monitor has a colour gamut of around 95% DCI-P3, and I confirmed that with the colorimeter, not just what is specified by the manufacturer. And that means that for content like this, it's running in SDR, the game, standard dynamic range, and that's really designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. So when you've got a monitor like this with a much wider colour gamut than that, it does mean that shades appear more saturated than they should. So you've got extra saturation, but the saturation you get here, it's what I call an even boost in saturation. It's very different to when you have a digital saturation enhancement. So this monitor has a feature, I think it's called color vibrance, which allows you to digitally enhance the saturation as well. And that's very similar to NVIDIA's digital vibrance setting or AMD's saturation control in their graphics drivers. And what these digital enhancements do is they pull shades close to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself. With this though, you've got a naturally expanded gamut, so shades maintain good spacing on the gamut, and you don't have that crushing of shade variety, and things don't look weirdly cartoonish and unnatural for that reason. But the saturation levels, they are quite strong, and things do look vibrant overall. And because of that strong consistency, which is something I'd mentioned using the GOM earlier, this means that the richness and the vibrancy is throughout the screen. So it's not like the TN and VA models where you get some losses of saturation towards the edge. So things do tend to just look nice and vibrant overall. And with this colour gamut as well, really quite a, you might say, quite stunning look to some shades. The fire here, for example, really nice glowing reddish oranges and yellow hues. The yellow hues look a bit more orange than they should in places. Some of the oranges look a little bit more red than they should, and some of the reds are really quite intense and fiery. But that's certainly preferable to the digital saturation enhancement where things are just crushed together and things just look like a sort of cartoonish fire with only a few shades. So there's a really nice variety of shades here. The natural environments as well, they've got some good rich greens, some nice autumnal colours here in this scene as well, some sort of golden oranges and browns, some reddish browns, and a good palette of greens. So they're not all sort of lush and deep, there are some lighter greens as well, some more muted green shades. But they do again appear a bit more saturated than they should, and this is kind of noticeable with the rifles here, for example. They have more of a reddish orange hue to the wood than they should have, and there's some logs here which appear a bit more reddish than they should rather than a more neutral brown. So they're just slight things, but overall I think users are going to like this look, and I have talked to users a lot about this kind of thing, and they do tend to like this look. It's not for everyone. This monitor does have an sRGB emulation mode if you prefer a more muted look, and that is activated in the colour section under colour mode. So if you set this to Rec 709, and this is explored more in the written review, this is an sRGB emulation mode. Things appear far more muted now. You can adjust the brightness, but the default brightness is actually very low for this setting. But the fire here, for example, looks far more muted. And actually, this is a look which some users might prefer. But I think, as I said, most users actually prefer the vibrancy of the native gamut. And these differences, they're really not going to be easy to see on the video. And that's because the capabilities of your own monitor certainly come into play here. So you're not really getting an accurate representation, but you should see that there's definitely a difference. And I'd wager that on the video, actually, this is going to look extremely oversaturated and quite weird, especially compared to the Rec 709 mode that I was showing you before. So overall, yeah, good, vibrant, consistent colour reproduction, the main strength of this model, really. I've now made one subtle change, and that's that I've activated HDR, High Dynamic Range. So I'm going to talk about High Dynamic Range now. This monitor offers VESA Display HDR 400 certification. That's the lowest level of VESA Display HDR certification that VESA will certify for. So it isn't by any means a true HDR experience, but there are still some advantages to using HDR on this monitor, and some things that it does bring to the table for HDR10 content, such as this game running in HDR. And this applies to console games as well. If you're using this monitor on a HDR compatible games console, or you're using HDMI, it applies to NVIDIA and AMD GPUs as well. I've tested both on this monitor. So the kind of experience I'm talking about here applies more broadly. I'm just using this as an example. I'll also show you Shadow of the Tomb Raider in HDR just for a little bit of extra variety. But you might notice on the video things just look different. It's kind of difficult to see the nature of these differences on videos for the reason I've already explained. But a key difference is that HDR content like this targets the DCI P3 color space. So colour mapping and the gamut is now more accurate, and that means that some of the oversaturation I was talking about before is reduced, so things look more natural. Kind of got rid of the reddish hue on some of the woods there. Some of these autumnal browns look more of a neutral brown shade rather than having overpowering red tints. The fire here, it looks very vibrant, but it doesn't have the kind of strong red hues to some of the oranges that it had before, but it certainly looks vibrant, and these shades are well beyond what you'd see from the sRGB colour space, and it certainly looks more vibrant than using the Rec 709 sRGB emulation setting on this monitor, which I showed you just before. The same with some of these paints here, nice deep greens which are beyond the sRGB colour palette. So with HDR you're basically getting a more natural look to things, but you still get those vibrant elements all the same. This monitor does have a few different HDR settings, so when you're running HDR as I am now, if you go into the OSD, there's not really very much you can change, so you can't adjust the brightness yourself. You can adjust the contrast level, sharpness, and a few other things, but in colour, for example, you can't change the colour temperature. But the main thing is this HDR mode setting, and there's a little hotkey on the controller there, HDRI, which allows you to cycle through these. I talk a bit more about these in the OSD video, and I go through them in the written review, but I'm just going to briefly show you them here. Game HDRI and Cinema HDRI, you'll notice there's an I after HDR there. These both use the Brightness Intelligence Plus functionality of the monitor, and that uses this central light sensor there to allow the monitor to react to changes in the ambient lighting, so your room lighting. And this is, to be honest, quite weird. The changes it makes, I don't agree with. Everyone has a different sensitivity to brightness, and they'll like to make their own changes based on this. And the point in HDR is actually to have a close coordination between the game content or the software, could be a movie as well, and the GPU and the monitor, and for a certain set of standards to be followed as closely as possible. With this, it's making all sorts of changes to the gamma, to the color temperature, to the brightness, which really just detracts from the HDR experience in many ways. The cinema mode is even worse in my opinion. So this is the game HDRI setting. The cinema HDRI setting also massively increases the gamma. So the gamma in general is just much higher. And it makes things look kind of cinematic, which some users might quite like. But again, it just detracts from the HDR experience and sort of the accurate portrayal of things. And I don't like this. And I do talk more about this in the written review, and I don't want to bang on too much, because if I don't like it, what's the point in me trying to advertise it to people? So I prefer the display HDR setting, which is more natural and it doesn't change things based on your room lighting to what it thinks it should be doing. And instead it just looks at the content, it looks at the HDR10 content and makes changes based on that. You probably would have noticed when I changed to the HDR setting, the display HDR setting, the color tone did shift quite a bit. And the main reason for that is that the other settings, the settings with I at the end, the cinema and game HDRI settings, they just look too cool in most lighting. As I mentioned, the color temperature does change depending on the lighting with those settings, but pretty much in any lighting, including in the evening, I noticed that they just looked too cool tinted, and really the overall balance was just messed up. So I'm not going to say anything more about those now. I'm just going to use the display HDR setting, talk about that. So another advantage of the HDR10 pipeline is that it allows 10-bit color support to be used. This monitor supports 10-bit color reproduction. However, if you're running it at 144 Hz, which I'm sure many of you will be doing, it has a 2-bit dithering stage which is offloaded to the GPU rather than being handled by the monitor. The end result of this, I've gone on about this in many reviews in the past, it doesn't really make much difference at all. And on this monitor, I've flicked between 120 Hz and 144 Hz, so monitor side dithering for that 2-bit stage versus GPU side dithering for that extra 2-bit stage. And honestly, it really makes very little difference. Side by side, certain scenes, you might notice some differences. I'm not saying there aren't any differences. However, really, even to my keen eye, I wouldn't worry about using 144 Hz for this reason. So regardless of whether you're using 144 Hz or a lower refresh rate, you get the 10-bit color reproduction used in HDR, and the monitor and GPU uses this, and you get what I call a nice and nuanced shade variety for these dark shades. So for example, the dark shades around the treads here. And on the video, this totally isn't going to come across at all. But to my eye, I can see this nice nuanced shade variety, and it's very different to if you were to simply change the gamma under SDR, because the shade variety is maintained in a very nice way. This is very different to if you simply decrease the gamma under SDR or use a gamma tweak, BenQ's black equalizer, for example. This really just sort of floods the image, and it doesn't maintain this nice variety of subtly different shades that you get under HDR. So that does give a nice look to things in terms of the shadow detailing and that kind of thing. At the high end as well, it has an effect. There's a more nuanced variety of very bright shades as well. This again won't come across on the video. This will just look like a big giant ball of light, but in practice you can actually see a nice gradient there, a nice smooth gradient, and it's much smoother than the gradient you'd see under SDR. So these rays of light, weather effects, smoke, that kind of thing, they're much smoother because of this nuanced variety of shades and the 10-bit color reproduction used there. So there are certainly advantages to HDR on this monitor. The other thing is that the brightness is quite high, so for daylight scenes like this, they have a sort of natural brightness to them. I'm going to talk a bit more about this side of things using Tomb Raider as an example, because you're probably sick of me just sort of talking about HDR on this scene. I'm now in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about HDR using this as an example. So you'll see here, this is a kind of mixed scene. It has plenty of dark content, but also plenty of much brighter content just next to each other. And you'll see for this predominantly dark scene here, if I sort of zoom in here, it becomes mainly dark, but there are some lighter elements, and that means that the backlight can't just shut off to really low levels as it would do if there was just black displayed everywhere. So the backlight luminance is actually quite high here, which gives you IPS glow. And it's visible even on brighter content like this because the backlight is pulsing to such high levels. This monitor doesn't support local dimming. That isn't a requirement of VESA Display HDR 400, although it is a requirement at high levels. So that means it can't have the backlight just shut off or display much lower luminances for this dark content, whereas the brighter content can be much brighter. And that means that you do get this kind of flooded look for darker content, especially if you're viewing in a darker room like I am at the moment. In brighter rooms, it's not so noticeable, although it is still an issue in terms of if you're expecting a sort of deep atmospheric experience. That's really not what you get here. And that's not what you get with any monitor under HDR if it lacks effective local dimming. And being an IPS type panel as well, there's the IPS glow, and that is brought about more strongly at high luminance levels, which you do get under HDR. But there are some nice elements to the HDR. As I mentioned with Battlefield before, colour reproduction, it's more accurate and the gamut is put to good use. So the greens here, they definitely look lush. They look much more vibrant than they would with the sRGB colour space, things restricted to that. But they have this sort of yellow hue under SDR on this monitor, an overly strong yellow hue to some of these greens, which make it look quite unnatural. And that's curtailed under HDR, so things just look more natural. Laura's skin tone as well, under HDR, it looks nice and natural. She has this kind of, I'd call it a bit of an unhealthy tan, sort of an unnatural tanned look to her skin under SDR, and that's removed under HDR. There's also the 10-bit colour reproduction, so you get the more nuanced shade variety, and the bright elements there, again, nuanced shade variety there. So nice sort of God rays there, nice smooth transitions there. However, the lack of local dimming again makes this scene quite unimpressive really. So the luminance is actually a bit above 400 candles per meter squared. You can see exactly what I measured in the written review. I think it was actually close to 500 candles per meter squared. But anyway, pretty bright, but not as bright as your VESA Display HDR 1000 level displays or above. And factor in the fact that there isn't any local dimming, it means this element here really should look darker than it does, but it doesn't because the backlight is really pulsing out this pretty high luminance throughout the whole screen. Global dimming, no local dimming. So that should really look dimmer than it should, and this element should actually look brighter than it should and would really pop with a proper HDR performance and really stand out beautifully well because of that. The glint on the water there as well, it doesn't stand out as much as it should, and the glint on the waxy leaf there doesn't stand out as much as it should. So with the lack of local dimming, it really isn't anywhere near a true HDR experience. There are those advantages which I mentioned before, but if you're expecting a nice atmospheric look to these darker shades or really amazing sort of bright, eye-popping bright elements, it isn't what you get here. So it isn't the best HDR implementation, but more often than not, they're at this kind of level or below. And actually, I'd say that the HDR implementation here is actually one of the better VESA Display HDR 400 level implementations I've seen. What I would say is that I think even with this global dimming, they could have been a bit more careful with the backlight brightness adjustments. So for really predominantly dark content like this, I don't think there's any need to have the luminance as high as it is, the backlight brightness as high as it is. So you've got that glow, it is exaggerated by the camera, but really they could have done with more careful control of the backlight illumination as well. It is worth mentioning though, there is an HDR luminance slider, as it's called on this game. And you'll probably see that the glow is back here, but I've actually just nudged this down to a very low value. And what that does is it does help these darker scenes look a bit more atmospheric, although I wouldn't say it looks deep and atmospheric by any stretch of the imagination. It just doesn't have that kind of bloom it does before. But the problem here is that the high-end luminance is much weaker. And actually you probably saw the backlight change quite suddenly there. I'm not sure if it would have come across on the video. You can see it dimming. You know, that's basically like a dynamic contrast function, which you get without local dimming. That's really all you can do. But these brighter elements with the HDR luminance slider set as it is, they don't have a brilliant brightness, and actually things are really crushed together in an awkward way. So you've lost your shade variety there. So it is important to be aware that the HDR luminance slider isn't the same as just limiting the overall luminance of the display. It makes all sorts of digital adjustments, and it's a calibration which really is sort of goes against what HDR should be doing. So you should really set this to a good level. And games do tend to have a little graphic which helps you set this, but I found on Tomb Raider, so it says that this should be nicely blended together. It might look blended together, but I assure you it's very clear that there is a grey background and a white motif in the middle, which is very distinct from the grey background. What it's telling you to do is to move this slide to the right until things look very blended, but you can actually slide this all the way to the right on Tomb Raider with this monitor and many others I've tested, and the motif will still be visible. But what I would say is for accurate reproduction, you should really have that quite far to the right, or at least halfway across. Otherwise, you're going to get this weird crushing of shades and things are going to look really awkward, even if your darker scenes look slightly more atmospheric than they otherwise would. So I appreciate this is a lot to take in, but what I would say is the HDR on this monitor, good mapping of the gamut, so puts the colour gamut to good use. Nice to have 10-bit colour reproduction. Good for tone mapping. And for those reasons, some people will really like to use HDR on this monitor. I actually quite like to use HDR on this monitor, even though I much prefer the HDR experience when you've got good local dimming and potentially a much more powerful backlight as well. That does make a big difference, having that, and it really does sort of make for a true HDR experience. But even without that, there are some advantages to the HDR experience on this monitor. I'm on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. So this monitor has 144Hz panel. That means it is outputting over twice as much visual information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz. I've got this game running at 144 frames a second at the moment, pretty consistently. You can see that in the top right there, 144. And that means that I'm getting the most out of the monitor in terms of the responsiveness. What this high refresh rate, high frame rate combination does for you, it enhances what I call the connected feel, and that describes what it feels like when you're actually interacting with the game world. So you're interacting with your character, you're just moving it around in the game world, and there's a certain precision and a certain fluidity to the movement, which is simply lacking at lower frame rates and refresh rates. This connected feel that I'm talking about, and the elements I'm talking about here, they are separate from input lag. You could have a model with a 60Hz refresh rate and extremely low input lag, but that doesn't mean the connected feel is going to be like it is here. Input lag is important for connected feel though, and this monitor has a low level of input lag. I measured under 3.5 milliseconds at 144 Hz. You can read a bit more about the methodology and some of the aspects related to that in the written review, the start of the responsiveness section where input lag's covered. But really this is a very low level, and combined with the 144 Hz refresh rate, it certainly feels like a nice fluid 144 Hz experience. The other aspect to consider with the high frame rate and high refresh rate combination is that you're getting a reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement. I'm not going to go on about this too much in terms of the mechanics of this, the science behind it if you prefer, and that's because that is mentioned in the written review, summarised in the written review, and there's an article on the website all about responsiveness which covers this. But it is an important concept to grasp, and it does mean that with this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination, there's a reduction in your eye movement, and it's that eye movement that causes most of the perceived blur you see. On top of that, you do have some potential weaknesses caused by slower than optimal pixel responses. They also add to perceived blur. They give you trailing, or ghosting as some people would call it. So it's always nice to have good fast pixel responses without issues there. This monitor has what's called AMA, Advanced Motion Acceleration, and that's how you adjust the pixel overdrive levels, the extent of greater grey acceleration used and how fast the overall pixel responses are. And you can access that in the main menu. It's under Color, Advanced, AMA. I like to use Premium, at least at high refresh rates, and I'll come on to this a bit more later. And with this setting, it isn't like the premium setting that you get on some BenQ monitors or the highest setting on some monitors where there's loads of overshoot everywhere and things look really messy. So, there's loads of bright halo trailing and stuff everywhere. There is a bit of that, and this is caused by these heavy voltage surges to accelerate the pixel transitions as much as possible. So behind this tree trunk here, for example, there's a bit of a bright halo trailing, as I call it. That's overshoot, and it's brighter than the background and therefore stands out a little bit because of that. But this isn't strong overshoot. The flag post here shows it as well. It's actually a bit clearer on the flag post if you're further back. But these examples of overshoot, I didn't find them particularly bothersome. I actually game on a Dell S2716DG as my main monitor, and that has a lot more overshoot than this one. I mean, sensitivity to overshoot does vary, so some users might find it eye-catching, so perhaps switch to the high setting, AMA high. It is quite well accelerated. It's not hugely slower in terms of the pixel responses, but there are some advantages to the premium setting. But even with this premium setting, there are some weaknesses in terms of pixel responses, some slower than optimal pixel transitions, where it says open range here, for example, and the white marker underneath that. Very light shade against a darker background, sort of medium to dark background. And that reveals some of the slower than optimal pixel transitions, which give what I call a powdery trailing. This is what I describe as a fairly light powdery trailing. It's not going to be clear on the video, but as I move the mouse, there's just a little bit of trailing around that object, and that does add to perceived blur. It's also there for the block beneath it, although it's even lighter there, so it's really just a very slight amount of it there, and depending on the angle, there's a bit of overshoot, a bit of this halo trailing that's brighter than even that light background there, so it kind of stands out a little bit, but it's nothing extreme there. And there are some other examples of this, but I'm not going to bore you to death by going on about this too much in the video because it's simply impossible to show you. And that's because these weaknesses aren't as profound as you'd see on some models where there'd be obvious trailing which would come across in the video, but they do add to perceived blur a bit. So if you compare it to, for example, my Dell S2716DG I was talking about before, there's a little bit more perceived blur. And also if you're comparing it to the models using LG's Nano IPS panel, for example the ViewSonic XG270QG we reviewed not long ago, there is an increase in perceived blur compared to that, and things just aren't quite as fast in terms of the pixel responses overall. But I'm not saying any of these weaknesses are particularly bad. I will, however, show you some more specific examples of this using a different scene now. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5. This one has lots of high contrast transitions, so there are lots of dark shades and much lighter shades combined. These are the kind of transitions which will show really obvious weaknesses on VA models. You might have seen my videos in the past where I show these sort of transitions with VA models, and you can see it quite obviously in the video because there's what I describe as smeary trailing or some heavy powdery trailing. On this model, things are much better in that respect. So with the boats down here, for example, there isn't that kind of obvious trailing as I circle the mouse, no smeary look to things. Up here, there's just a little bit of powdery trailing behind the wooden elements of the sort of makeshift roof there. And that again adds a little bit to perceived blur. Might not come across on the video though, because it's still what I'd describe as light powdery trailing. It isn't smeary, it's just a little bit of extra powdery trailing behind the object, which ideally wouldn't be there, that's all it is. And behind the tree and the flag post there, with VA models, typically there's some really obvious weaknesses for these transitions, but here, nothing of that sort. Really quite fast pixel responses here. There's actually a touch of overshoot halo trailing behind the tree to the left when I strafe to the right. Probably won't come across very obviously on the video though, because it's really quite weak overshoot. Not going to be too obvious to people. But I'm just going to show you the AMA high settings. I did mention that before, but didn't really show it, just for comparison. With that, there's really no overshoot to speak of, so that slight overshoot behind the tree is now gone. Well, actually, there might be a small amount. Now I've said that. There's a small amount, but it's reduced. It's reduced from an already low level. But I do notice the transitions here that were quite weak with premium, but didn't actually show strong overshoot. They're now weaker with high. So it's still what I describe as light powdery trailing, but it is more noticeable. It extends further back from the object, and that means that the perceived blur is increased further. The boats down here are starting to show more of this powdery trailing as well. It doesn't take on a smeary quality, but the transitions here are clearly slower. And with premium, they were sped up without adding obvious overshoot here. So I do prefer to use the premium setting. at least at these higher frame rates and higher refresh rates. I'll come on to that shortly because I'm going to be talking about adaptive sync, which this monitor supports. And again, the pixel transitions here. For this white blob, they show some of that powdery trailing. It's actually fairly extended, but I'm still using AMA high. If I set that to premium instead, that's cut down. It's still there. There are some weaknesses with this little white blob there with the darker to medium shades in the background, but nothing extreme. Adaptive sync then. That's a very nice feature on this monitor, and it's quite common on monitors these days. This one supports it, and it means that the monitor can adjust its refresh rate on the fly to try and match the frame rate of the content. And this reduces tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. More specifically, if you didn't have adaptive sync, you would get tearing if you had VSync disabled, or you'd get stuttering if you had VSync enabled. So it's nice not to have these interruptions. And adaptive sync on this model means that you can use AMD FreeSync if you've got a compatible AMD GPU or system, or you can use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. They work in much the same way. You can also use HDR at the same time, that's not a problem. And that includes on NVIDIA and AMD systems which support the technology. The only difference is that the NVIDIA floor of operation, and that means the lowest refresh rate that the monitor will actually run at, that's 55 Hz instead of 48 Hz for FreeSync. But below this, the monitor uses LFC, low frame rate compensation, or at least it sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate, and that keeps tearing and stuttering and these mismatches at bay as well, and it works very effectively. There is a little bit of a transition period between these. Of course, I'm not going through them now because I'm at about 144 frames a second, but you might notice there are some occasional dips, even now, below 144, and without adaptive sync on, that would give me obvious tearing or stuttering, or would give you obvious tearing or stuttering in the same scenario. I'm going to increase the graphics settings further and talk a bit more about what happens when I'm closer to, say, 100 frames a second, 100 Hz. I've ramped up the graphics settings now, and it's around 100 frames a second, and that means that the connected feel isn't quite as good as it was at 144 Hz, 144 frames a second. That has reduced, and that's just purely because the frame rate is lower now. That also gives you an increase in perceived blur through the mechanisms described earlier. So you've got an increase in eye movement, which increases your perceived blur. The pixel responsiveness. Now this is a bit of a strange one, and this is a difference between models which have an NVIDIA G-Sync module and ones like this which just use adaptive sync, and therefore you're using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode or AMD FreeSync. And that is that they don't use variable overdrive. So with G-Sync modules, the pixel overdrive levels are always retuned as your refresh rate changes. And that means that as your refresh rate reduces, you don't get ever increasing levels of overshoot. With adaptive sync models like this, overshoot can become an issue because these very fast pixel responses remain. I'm using AMA Premium, remember, the fastest pixel overdrive setting, and actually the overshoot becomes more pronounced as your refresh rate decreases. This isn't something you observe if you disable adaptive sync, because it is purely down to the decreased refresh rate and the changes in the voltage behavior that this causes. So you should ideally have things retuned, but that doesn't happen. However, I'm at around 100 frames a second at the moment. There is an increase in overshoot, but I wouldn't say it becomes extreme. So behind that flag post there and that tree, there was overshoot before, and now it is clearer bright halo trailing, which stands out a bit to my eye. But I don't find this particularly bothersome, so I'd still use the premium setting here, but sensitivity to overshoot does vary, so you might want to use the high setting instead. But that becomes more relevant as the refresh rate decreases further, so I'll increase the graphics settings even more. I've increased the graphics settings further. I'm around 60 frames a second, 60 Hz at the moment. The overshoot levels are much stronger now. You can see it behind the flag post and the tree quite clearly now, at least I can. Hopefully it'll come across on the video. Should be able to see that halo trailing. I sometimes like to call this snail slime trailing because it looks like the trail that a snail would leave with its slime behind it. So if you do find this unsightly, I just recommend switching to AMA High, which will reduce this quite a lot. So again, that's in color, advanced AMA. Set that to high, and that is as good as gone, the overshoot. And AMA High, it still offers a good level of acceleration, and certainly for these lower frame rates. So say when you're in the double digits, I mean, there are no hard and fast rules about this, but certainly when you're easily below 100 frames a second, really AMA High performs very well. So your pixel response requirements are slackened off, so having a bit of a lower level of acceleration isn't really a problem in terms of giving you extra trailing, but it does cut down on this overshoot. So my general advice would simply be AMA High if you're frequently in the double digits. If you're frequently in the triple digits, consider the premium setting. But really you just have to do this according to your own taste. It's also worth mentioning that if you go into the OSD system, go to System, Information, it displays current resolution there, and it has at 59, so that shows the refresh rate that the monitor is running at, or was running at when you entered information. So you'll see it now says 60, because the frame rate's changed slightly. So it doesn't update in real time, but it does give you an indication that the technology is working. So if you're seeing that matching the frame rate, that's a good sign. But remember I said that frame multiplication technology, or LFC-like multiplication technology, is used. LFC-like because LFC is technically an AMD trademark, and NVIDIA can't really refer to it as LFC, but it's effectively the same thing. I'm using an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti at the moment, so it takes quite a bit to get it to drop down this low on this kind of scene. So I'm going to increase the graphics settings a little bit more to see if I can get it below that boundary to show you what the display there changes to. So I've ramped the graphics settings up further. You can see my frame rate counter's gone red. It's actually below 40 frames a second now. And that is below the hardware floor of operation for FreeSync and G-Sync compatible mode on this monitor. So information, it now says 80. So it's not running at 40 Hz because it can't do that, but it's running at 80 Hz instead. And that does keep tearing and stuttering at bay. There's not really much more to talk about in terms of responsiveness. I think I've been wittering on for long enough. I like to do that when I talk about responsiveness on monitors. It's a very interesting area to many people, I know, but even so, you can only hear me talk about it for so long before falling asleep. All I would say though is this monitor isn't the most responsive IPS type 144Hz model I've used. That's largely down to the panel which is used. It's just not quite as fast as the LG Nano IPS panels. It's not really quite as fast as the older AU Optronics 144Hz panels either. I do think that BenQ has optimized the pixel overdrive nicely and got the most that you can really expect out of this panel. And I also think that the experience is one which many gamers are going to enjoy because it does put the 144Hz refresh rate to good use. Comparing it to even the fastest VA models, for example, the LG 32GK850G, that's a good example of a fast VA model. Even they have weaknesses far beyond what this model has. So the weaknesses here, they're just slight compared to that kind of thing. And I realise I didn't show you AMA off, so just for completeness, I'm going to show you that. I'm back at 144 frames a second now, 144 Hz. So I'll just show you that quickly, just for completeness. This ramps up the powdery trailing significantly. It actually has a bit of a smeary quality in places. For example, the wood of the makeshift roof there almost looks VA-like in places actually. No overshoot, naturally, none at all, but really very slow pixel responses, some obvious weaknesses, not necessarily going to come across on the video, but there's just an obvious increase in overall perceived blur levels. So this isn't a setting I think anyone would want to use. AMA High is nicely tuned, AMA Premium is very nicely tuned in terms of performance at the high refresh rates as well. To wrap up then, in terms of the external features, the main criticism might be pointed to the fact that it has very limited ergonomic flexibility, tilt-only stand, but it does have VESA holes at the back, so I suppose that's a nice addition. The rustic brown colour as well, that won't be to everyone's taste, but some people will find it quite appealing and it is quite unique. And the stand base itself, I quite like the powder-coated metal finish. I'm sure people who have looked at my videos in the past will know I'm quite a fan of metal instead of plastics used in parts of the monitor like that. The speaker system as well, that's a sort of key feature of this monitor in terms of the external features. Well, technically it's an internal feature, but you know what I mean. The main aspect of that's really the subwoofer at the back. and that does change the sound and brings it to a level beyond what you'd expect from most integrated monitor speakers. They're not the best monitor speakers I've heard, but they're definitely usable, and I got good use out of them myself in the course of this review when I just wanted a break from my headphones, or I just felt like blaring some music out or something like that. So they're certainly a nice little addition. And this remote here as well, definitely worth a mention. Very much like having that. I'd like to see more monitors have that kind of thing. And as a reviewer, I'm frequently in the OSD system and frequently trying to sit behind a camera mounted to a tripod. Using the OSD at the same time isn't possible, but with this remote it is, so I do like that feature. I suppose it's worth mentioning as well BI Plus, Brightness Intelligence Plus, because that's a specific feature of this monitor. Don't think much of that, and that's the last I'm going to say about that. Performance-wise, the contrast of the monitor was largely in line with the specifications for the panel and largely in line with my expectations for the panel. I've used some models in the past with the same panel, and certainly lots with the same panel type, but the static contrast was a little bit beyond the specified 1000 to 1. It was close to 1100 to 1 after the adjustments made to my test settings, but my unit did suffer quite a bit from backlight bleed, particularly towards the bottom left corner, and that brought out IPS glow a bit more in that region. IPS glow is something which all units are going to suffer from. Backlight bleed varies between individual units, but the two do kind of interact with one another, so to speak. And if you've got bad backlight bleed or moderate backlight bleed, then it can cause the IPS glow to be brought out more obviously. Now, IPS glow, it did affect the atmosphere, especially for dark scenes and especially if sitting in a fairly dimly lit room. But it's pretty typical for IPS type panels. The contrast isn't really the main strength of them for this reason, but the static contrast certainly is a bit higher than it is on some IPS type models. For example, LG's recent Nano IPS panels with high refresh rates used on the LG 27850G and the ViewSonic XG270QG, for example. They do not offer the same kind of static contrast as this. For most users, this difference isn't going to be obvious, and certainly if you factor in the IPS glow and potential backlight bleed, it really kind of levels the playing field more than you might expect on paper. It's also worth mentioning that as an IPS type panel, the gamma consistency was very good, and that meant that the detail levels, aside from the IPS glow, which does ebb away at the detail peripherally, especially towards the bottom corners of the screen from a normal viewing position, aside from that, the detail levels were quite consistent. The gamma consistency was very strong. That meant you didn't get this sort of gradient of detail for dark scenes that you get on TN models, where things look way lighter than they should lower down and much darker than they should higher up. And you don't get the kind of inconsistencies you get on VA models where you get that sort of black crush in the middle where things look far too blended, and further out they look potentially less blended than they should. So it was nice to have a certain level of consistency there. The screen surface, also worth a mention, light matte anti-glare, kept things quite clear, quite crisp. Whilst it wasn't quite the smoothest matte screen surface I've used, it wasn't obtrusively grainy either, and most users will find this absolutely fine. It's also worth quickly mentioning the resolution. It's a nice resolution, good pixel density, and a good sort of compromise, I suppose you might say, between performance and clarity. Certainly easier to run than high refresh rate 4K UHD monitors. In terms of the colour reproduction, really the main strength of IPS type panels, and this was no exception. It offered around 95% DCI-P3 colour gamut coverage, so that offers good vibrancy to the image. It does cause some oversaturation of content designed with the sRGB colour space in mind, but I didn't find this extreme, and many users would quite like this because it's an even boost in saturation. It's not a digital saturation boost or anything like that. The colour consistency was also strong, so you don't get these sort of shifts you get with TN models vertically, or these kind of shifts you get on VA models comparing the centre to more peripheral regions of the screen, particularly the sides and bottom. So things maintain their richness throughout the screen very nicely. The monitor also supports HDR, not a high level of HDR support though, so not a true full-fat HDR experience by any stretch of the imagination, but it is VESA HDR 400 certified, and the brightness was actually higher than that, but it doesn't offer any local dimming, so it didn't really tick that contrast box at all, certainly not for a good HDR performance. But the colour gamut was put to good use, provided you were using an appropriate HDR mode. I said I wouldn't mention Brightness Intelligence Plus further, but the HDR-I modes do use that, and that's the main reason I don't like to use them. But the other HDR mode doesn't use that, and it puts the HDR signal to good use, the HDR10 signal. So you get 10-bit color processing, you get the color gamut put to more appropriate use, and that worked quite nicely in terms of the HDR on this monitor, even if it wasn't anywhere near a full-fat HDR experience. In terms of the responsiveness of the monitor, good low input lag, indicating a very low signal delay, so that won't be an issue for people. 144Hz refresh rate put to good use overall, good effective gray-to-gray acceleration. The panel isn't natively as fast as some of the IPS type panels out there, so there were some weaknesses in terms of a bit of powder trailing in places or overshoot in places, depending on what you were looking at and the AMA setting you were using on the monitor. But these weaknesses were not massive, and certainly if you compare to VA panels, nothing like that. But if you're really sensitive to that kind of thing, or you just want the best, then perhaps consider a model using an LG Nano IPS panel instead, because they're just natively a bit faster. The monitor also supports adaptive sync, and that worked to allow both AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. Worked very nicely to get rid of tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. If, like me, you're sensitive to that kind of thing, it's really nice to have that technology enabled. And on this model, you could use it at the same time as HDR, and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode worked much the same as FreeSync, except for a slight difference in the flow of operation. But they both had LFC or LFC-like technologies enabled, so below that flow of operation they still worked. I don't know if I actually mentioned before, I have this strange feeling I didn't mention before, but where you pass this LFC boundary or this LFC-like boundary of, say, 48Hz for AMD FreeSync or 55Hz for NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, when you get below that and this LFC-like technology kicks in, there is a momentary stuttering. So if you're frequently passing that boundary, it could be annoying, but once you're actually past it, it is just a momentary stuttering. Things just work in much the same way. So overall, I did enjoy using this monitor. Color reproduction is definitely the main strength. Responsiveness is certainly quite good. Not amazing, but certainly a lot better than any VA model I've come across, and really not bad at all for the panel type. And able to put the 144Hz refresh rate to good use. Adaptive sync implementation was good, and I think the AMA settings were quite well tuned, with high and premium both having their place. The contrast performance, largely expected for the panel type. It's a bit of a shame that my unit had quite a bit of backlight bleed, but that is just to show you that monitor manufacturers don't always cherry pick their review samples, because I know some people think that they just give us incredible review samples which are absolutely perfect. Not the case at all. But this isn't necessarily indicative of what you can expect on your monitor, although just looking more broadly at monitors which use this panel and similar panels, it is fair to expect some degree of backlight bleed. If you're expecting perfection, you're probably going to end up disappointed. So in terms of will I recommend this monitor, that sort of partly comes down to the pricing in your market, because the pricing of this monitor has been quite volatile actually. I mainly track US prices, and that's because most of my user base does actually come from the US. But you know, we are certainly a global brand, so to speak, and we get users from all over the place. You're probably not from the US yourself. You might be thinking, what am I on about? I've been a fan of this site for years. I'm not from the US. That's fair enough. I'm just saying that most of our users do come from the US versus any other single geographical location. So I mainly go by US prices. When I first started the review, it was actually around $450. And at that price, it was really sort of raising my eyebrows and making me think, you know, this is certainly something I could quite easily recommend. Really undercuts competing monitors quite nicely, or is in line with other monitors and sort of stands out a bit because of some of the unique features and really nice overall performance. However, it's now around $600 US, and that's actually the RRP of the monitor, so it's not exactly unexpected, but it does sort of put a little bit of a kibosh on me strongly recommending this monitor just at that price. And that's because you compare it to some of the competing monitors. The Gigabyte Aorus FI27QP comes to mind, and that's Gigabyte's fully fledged sort of all bells and whistles attached monitor, which uses the same panel as this, but it also has a 165Hz refresh rate. It's got HBR3, which lets it use 10-bit color signal monitor side without any GPU dithering as well, with HDR enabled, full refresh rate, all of that stuff. So, I mean, that I suppose could be a more compelling option for some, considering it's actually a bit above $500 at the moment. So this monitor is more expensive than that. This kind of makes it difficult to recommend. And we're actually going to review that monitor next, the Gigabyte Aorus FI27QP. There's also the ViewSonic XG270QG at around $600. So that does offer better responsiveness than this monitor. It offers a slightly wider color gamut, so a little bit richer color, but there certainly isn't what I'd call a huge difference in terms of the color reproduction. Even if you had both side by side, I think most users would find the vibrancy levels quite comparable really, and both monitors certainly giving a vibrant and consistent output to the image. The contrast is actually a bit stronger on this model, but again, it can sort of depend on your backlight bleed and that kind of thing. So it's a bit difficult to compare, even if it does have a static contrast advantage. But then I suppose you have to consider how much those speakers and this nice little remote and just the general look of the monitor appeals to you. And I suppose it is worth mentioning as well, it does offer good flexibility in terms of allowing sharpness control if you're going to be running it at a lower than native resolution. I talk a bit more about that in the interpolation section of the written review. So that's really all there is to the BenQ EX2780Q. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.